Welcome everyone to the launch of the Armed Conflict Survey 2016, which provides data and analysis of the military, political and humanitarian dimensions of the world's armed conflicts. It includes maps, infographics, and a highly regarded chart of conflict to illustrate key trends, as well as thematic essays by some of the world's leading experts on conflict. This is the second edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, drawing on data from our Armed Conflict database, which monitors the world's active armed conflicts on a daily basis and is gaining increasing attention from governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. The essays in this year's edition of the survey are on pessimism and planning in armed conflict, the political economy of violent conflict, the threat from foreign fighters, and the changing role of female combatants. On our panel today are Dr. Anastasia Voronkova, who is editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, Virginia Komolli, Research Fellow for Security and Development, Hebatala Taha, Research Analyst at ISS Middle East, Jens Wardener, Research Analyst for Armed Conflict, and Nigel Inkster, ISS Director of Future Conflict and Cybersecurity. I'll ask Nigel to speak first, inspired by the essay on the threat from foreign fighters. After that, I will present an overview of the principal findings of the survey, and then our panel will answer your questions. Nigel. Wherever.
Okay, so I'll speak from here. Okay, well, one of the interesting factors around the dramatic rise of Islamic State that we witnessed in 2014 is the level of foreign fighters that this conflict attracted. As of December last year, I think the figure was somewhere in the region of 30,000 foreign fighters coming from a total of 87 countries. By far the majority of these foreign fighters came from countries in the Middle East, with the biggest cohorts coming from Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. But there were also significant numbers coming from Western European countries, and one or two countries, in particular Belgium, saw higher levels of participation by their nationals in the Islamic State conflict than had been the case with the Afghan Jihad or with Al-Qaeda. So there is an issue here, and the problem was, of course, not just going, but coming back. The problem that has been referred to as bleed out, when individuals from particular countries go to the conflict zones, acquire military skills, combat experience, and indoctrination, and then return to their home countries and carry on the fight there. It's been estimated that somewhere between 20 to 30% of foreign fighters have gone back to their home countries. So in the case of some states, and I think the United Kingdom is one such, the figure is, the percentage is more like, has been estimated at closer to 50%. That's 50% of maybe 800 people who have apparently gone from the UK. Now we need to get all this in perspective, because of course a lot of these foreign fighters are going on a one-way ticket. Many of them end up serving as cannon fodder and quickly killed off. Some volunteer as suicide bombers, quickly killed off. Others are revolted and horrified by the realities of the singular brutalities that they witness and experience in Syria and Iraq, and become alienated and want only to get away. So by no means all of those who go to take part in the jihad in Syria and Iraq are going to come back and cause trouble. And even of those who do, many will not carry on the fight back in their home countries, either because they become disillusioned or because they simply don't want to drag their families, friends, communities into problems with the authorities in their home countries. But this still leaves a significant cohort of fighters who are properly trained, battle-hardened, combat-experienced, and strongly indoctrinated. And it is now clear that for Islamic State, the carrying on the conflict in third countries is, if you like, the third leg of a tripod, the other two legs being the carrying on of the conflict in the caliphate, that is Syria and Iraq, and the second leg being cultivating relations with affiliated groups in other Islamic states. So that's the kind of lineup of forces. And we saw last November in Paris and this year in Brussels what this bleed out can translate into. The Paris attacks resulted in 130 deaths, some 320 plus people injured, some of them with life-changing injuries, 30 killed in Brussels and many more injured, and the shock effect that you always get from attacks of this kind. What we've seen is a significant transition from what was done by Al-Qaeda, which was really an attempt to replicate the large-scale bombing attacks that were epitomized by 9/11, directed very much by controllers in the tribal areas of Pakistan, to a model that focuses more on mass casualty, multiple shootings of the kind we witnessed in Paris by groups who may be operating under the strategic direction of Islamic State, but which at a tactical level are given significant leeway to work out what they are going to do. And this, of course, this situation poses all sorts of problems for security and intelligence services and police forces. There are many more people to keep track of than was the case in the previous decade. This kind of Fedayeen style attack, mass shooting, much more difficult to anticipate and much more difficult to control when it's actually happening. Against this, I think we have to bear in mind that the mastermind of the Paris attacks, Abdelhamid Abaoud, was obviously a very talented young man, even if his talents were put to perverse use. He clearly had charisma, leadership, planning, and organizational skills of a high order. And without those skills, it is open to debate whether the Paris attacks would have been anything like as successful as they in effect were. I don't know how many more Abdelhamid Abaoud's Islamic State is going to be able to produce. Let's not forget that the same group had in it one individual who managed to shoot himself in the foot whilst he was en route to launch his attack, had to call the emergency services and then explain why his car boot was filled with military-grade ordnance. So, not all these people are steely-eyed killers with high intelligence. We also need to bear in mind, too, that intelligence services and security services are bigger, better resourced, and better equipped generally to deal with the threat from Islamist terrorism than they were in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. A lot has been learnt, and a culture of intelligence sharing and collaboration, particularly amongst the intelligence services of liberal democracies, but also more widely with services in Islamic states, Islamic countries, is much better developed than it was. So I think the message here is, to quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. There will be more of this. Of that we can be absolutely certain. An inherent problem with terrorism is that it is episodic, rather like London buses. You wait forever, nothing happens, and all of a sudden 3 identically numbered vehicles turn up. And we can expect to see more atrocities, more attacks, with Islamic State trying to set the bar ever higher in terms of brutality and effect. But whilst this is a worrying problem and something that undoubtedly keeps security, intelligence services and police forces awake at night, it is not, for us, by any means, an existential problem and needs to be kept in perspective.
Nigel, thank you. I'll now run through some of the principal findings in the survey, and then very happy to field your questions to the panel. 2015 was the year that, for better or worse, the state struck back in many of the world's largest armed conflicts, recapturing territory from rebels in the face of considerable resistance. We saw this in Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen. Government forces there recapturing territory. Often this was achieved with the help of foreign allies. The introduction of Russian air power enabled the Syrian government to go onto the offensive and recover some 10,000 square kilometers of territory, including towns to the south and east of Aleppo, the town of Karyatayn in Homs province, and strategically important parts of Dara, Latakia, and Hama provinces. The US-led coalition increased the tempo of its airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, while on the ground, Iranian forces supported government offensives, including the recapture of Tikrit. In Nigeria, the army announced it had recovered all of the towns lost to Boko Haram in 2014. In this effort, it was supported by the multinational Joint Task Force, to which Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Benin contributed troops. In Somalia, the National Army and the African Union Force AMISOM conducted successful offensives against al-Shabaab strongholds in the south. They also recaptured several towns and villages in the provinces of Gedo, Bakul, and Bay. Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies conducted airstrikes in Yemen and later inserted advisors, trainers, and ultimately their own troops to help President Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi recover Aden and 4 other provinces from the Houthis. Amid this trend of rising intervention, we note a distinct reversion to more classical forms of statecraft, with power being projected to secure national interests. Whereas previously this was largely the preserve of the P5, it is now being pursued with alacrity and determination by second-tier and regional powers. Egypt and Turkey also upped the ante in their fight against insurgent groups, but without scoring any notable territorial gains. Egypt's President, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, strengthened his grip on power and pursued a tougher approach to insurgents nationally, and particularly in the Sinai, where the army practiced a scorched earth policy. In Turkey, the government responded to increased security threats with greater military force, bombing PKK camps in neighboring states and seeking to wrest control of southeastern cities from insurgents. The Armed Conflict Database shows that fatalities in Turkey in 2015 were at their highest level in 15 years, taking the country back to a level of violence last seen before the capture of Abdullah Öcalan. In the previous edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, we noted that since 2008 there had been a decrease in the number of active conflicts globally, but a steady increase in the fatality toll from them. In 2015, this death toll halted its rapid ascent, while all major active conflicts persisted. Globally, in 2015, conflict fatalities amounted to 167,000. Half of those deaths occurred in the Middle East and North Africa, and a further 21% in Latin America. In those 2 regions, fatalities remain stubbornly high, and there are few signs of conflicts moving towards de-escalation or resolution. On our conservative count, the death toll in Syria fell in 2015 to 55,000, yet still this accounts for 1/3 of fatalities globally. conflict deaths rose sharply in Turkey, Egypt, and Yemen to 2,000, 3,000, and 7,500 respectively. We judged that the prospects for resolution or de-escalation grew more distant in these three conflicts, and that those prospects drew no closer in Iraq, the Palestinian territories, or Lebanon. Syria's ceasefire has kindled some hope of a political solution there, as have the attritional effects of 4 years of fighting on the disposition of forces, but we remain doubtful that the civil war will be resolved in the near term. Nearly all of Latin America's fatalities took place in Mexico and the Central American triangle of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, where combined conflict deaths rose to 34,000 from 30,000 a year earlier. Fatalities in these conflicts are on a par with Iraq, even though none of the fighting is conducted with heavy weaponry. The one bright spot for Latin America was the gathering momentum of Colombia's peace negotiations and the sharp decline in FARC attacks in the second half of 2015, which helped to push down annual fatalities to 350 from 500 a year earlier and 1,000 in 2013. The conflict in Afghanistan registered the largest increase in fatalities this year, to 15,000. 2 years earlier, the figure was 3,500, underlining the decline in security since ISAF began its drawdown in earnest. Fatalities also rose markedly in Nigeria's battle with Boko Haram, reaching 11,000, up from 7,000 a year earlier. Globally, 6 conflicts, Syria, Iraq, Mexico, Central America, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, account for 4/5 of global fatalities, 80%. Elsewhere, developments are more encouraging. The dominant trend in active conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia is towards de-escalation or resolution. In our judgment, the prospects for conflict resolution in Mali, the Central African Republic, and Somalia improved during 2015. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and Sudan, they became no worse. We calculate that the death toll in sub-Saharan Africa's conflicts fell to 24,000 in 2015 from 30,000 a year earlier, and this is notwithstanding the increase in fatalities registered in Nigeria. Developments in India and Southeast Asia also inspire some optimism. The conflicts in Myanmar, southern Thailand, the Philippines, and India's Nagaland moved closer to resolution in 2015. Few of the region's other conflicts became appreciably worse, and fatalities in Southeast Asia plus India barely exceeded 2,000. In the battle against ISIS across the Middle East and North Africa, we have seen a displacement effect. As the group lost territory in Syria and Iraq, it sought to bolster its presence in Libya. Developments there underline the challenges facing the group beyond its home region, but also its resilience. Islamic State seized control of the eastern city of Derna, only to be ejected by citizens who were revolted by the group's brutality. The pattern was nearly repeated in Sirte, the city that the group aspires to become a second Raqqa or another capital, as locals again rose up against the Islamic State. ISIS faces a challenge in Libya. Its fighters there are seen as outsiders, and the society lacks the sectarian divisions on which the jihadists have fed in Iraq and Syria. Yet the group's success in reinforcing Sirte testifies to its determination and its resources. It will not be ejected swiftly or easily. Progress towards peace talks between Libya's rival governments was partly a consequence of rising international concern about ISIS. And this is not the only example of the catalyzing effect that the Islamic State has had on international cooperation. Concern at the threat emanating from Syria prompted renewed efforts by the US and Russia to broker a ceasefire and launch peace talks. Elsewhere in the world, the rise of ISIS has inspired cooperation between unlikely partners. Israel and Hamas have tacitly agreed to work together to keep the group out of the Gaza Strip. And Russia has shared intelligence with the Taliban to stop the Islamic State advancing in Afghanistan. Although there are fewer armed conflicts today than a decade ago, the number of refugees and internally displaced people has surged, from 33 million in 2013 to 43 million in 2014 and 46 million by the middle of last year. Alongside this quantum leap in forced displacement, the distribution of refugees and IDPs has changed in just a few years. Whereas in the past they were mainly housed in rural camps, today most reside in towns and cities. As the chart of conflict notes, around 80% of refugees in Turkey and Jordan reside in cities. Globally, there are 2 IDPs for every refugee. Often, IDPs face greater risks to their security and well-being than refugees, and they also tend to be displaced for longer. The average duration for an IDP is now 23 years, and for a refugee, 17 years. Displacement on this scale is a humanitarian, political, and economic disaster for the states in conflict and for many of their neighbours. It presents huge obstacles to stabilisation, conflict resolution, and reconstruction. As the previous edition of the Armed Conflict Survey noted, a solution to preventing forced displacement has 3 elements. Firstly, the application of effective pressure on conflict parties to abide by the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. That will limit the scale of initial displacement and facilitate the return of displaced people. Secondly, securing better access for humanitarian relief in the country of conflict. That way, civilians will not be forced to flee simply to access food, water, and shelter. Thirdly, and most importantly, greater political action to de-escalate and resolve the conflicts themselves. If states, policymakers are to embrace this challenge, they will have to expend more political and economic resources and devote a greater proportion of those resources to tackling the drivers of conflict rather than merely treating some of the symptoms. Alongside a growing influx of refugees, Europe has also in the past year experienced terrorist attacks in which EU nationals who fought in Syria and Iraq played a leading role. Daniel Byman, writing in this year's Armed Conflict Survey, notes that the post-2010 conflicts in Syria and Iraq have attracted more foreign fighters than even the anti-Soviet resistance in Afghanistan, which spawned al-Qaeda. Not all such conflicts exhibit bleed-out, in which foreign fighters return home and attack their fellow citizens. Of the 30,000 foreigners in the ranks of Islamic State, approximately 5,000 are believed to be Westerners. Of these, 1/5 or more are likely to die on the battlefield. Others will remain abroad to avoid arrest. Some will return home war-weary or deterred from engaging in violence by the risk of endangering friends or family. This leaves, as Nigel noted, a core of returnees, battle-hardened and indoctrinated, that pose a threat to their home states. A measure of insecurity is an inescapable cost of living in a liberal society. Western security services are larger, better informed, and better funded than they were before 9/11, but they cannot thwart every plot. Smarter management of bleed-out can help, but the threat will remain while conflicts remain active. For policymakers wrestling with the challenge of bringing conflicts to an end, we hope that the Armed Conflict Survey and database will constitute principal sources of data and analysis. We're happy now to take your questions. Yes, sir, please. If you just wait for the microphone to come to you. If you just wait for the microphone to come to you, please. Oh.
Thank you. My name is Mahmoud Ali. I'm a member here at the Institute. Question primarily aimed at Nigel Inkster because he's, after all, the Director of Future Conflict, but the panel more generally. It seems to me, being an ancient person, went to school in the 1980s, we were back in the 1980s when great powers didn't engage in direct conflict among themselves, but proxy war raged across the periphery. That seems to be something that's happening again. So on that basis, my question is, what are your views with regard to the possibilities of escalation, say in Ukraine or in East Asia, to great power conflict, and why you think that is the case? Thank you.
Okay, maybe Nigel first, and then if Anastasia or Jens would like to bite on either of the regions mentioned, they can.
Okay, well, I'd like to take issue with your premise because I don't actually think that what we're seeing is a return to proxy war between great powers. You're certainly right that this was a characteristic of the world in the 1980s, but I don't really see that so readily apparent in today's situation. It's true that in the case of Syria we have the United States effectively on one side and Russia on the other side. But in that conflict I detect that Russia has relatively few clear-cut strategic objectives in that conflict, and is unlikely to want to engage in behavior that risks escalation. In Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear now that what Putin wants to do is not to take over territory in Ukraine. He's made it pretty clear that he does not want to do that. There is no benefit to him in taking over a swathe of impoverished Rust Belt. What he wants to do is to maintain the capability to keep Ukraine off balance and effectively to prevent it from doing anything that is perceived as contrary to Russian interests. So basically, there is a gap into which he can insert a lever at any time and manipulate that if he sees developments. In the unlikely event that Ukraine were, for example, to want to join NATO, he would be able to exert pressure there. And if we look east to the South China Sea, then in long-term strategic terms, I think there is a major question about the extent to which the United States will remain the preeminent Western Pacific naval power in the long term, and that is a game that we see being played out today. But that remains unresolved, and again, I think that is a conflict in which both sides are acutely aware of the risk of escalation and anxious to avoid it.
Okay. Gentleman at the back, please.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Nicholas, you referred at the end of your words about the possible reactions of governments in Europe to increased terrorist activity here. Could you say a bit more about that, and whether you believe that the governments here would accept that the reduction in freedoms is or isn't a price worth paying to further protect the individual? And maybe you could comment on, I think I'm right in saying, the first point about the national security strategy was to say the protection of the individual is the first priority of a government, and maybe say something about where you think freedoms might go in relation to that.
Thank you. I would not dream of talking about counter-terrorism when Nigel Ligster is on the same podium as I am. So, Nigel, would you care to take that one, please?
Yeah. Well, obviously, you always have this tension, this difficulty in deciding, where the balance should be. But I think it's fair to say that, broadly speaking, the counter-terrorism strategies of European countries is essentially to ensure that normal life can carry on. If you look at the UK's contest strategy, that's very much what is at the heart of that strategy. Now, of course, there are areas where potentially that freedom arguably can be infringed upon, and one of the key areas in which that particular debate is played out is the whole question of the activities of signals intelligence agencies. We have at the moment in the United Kingdom an investigatory powers bill going through Parliament, which aspires to be a kind of one-stop shop that sets out in detail how the intelligence agencies and other public authorities will conduct various forms of surveillance, predominantly electronic, and what will be the measures in place to oversee these activities and to guard against abuses. But I think it's important in this context to emphasize that what is being done here has been mischaracterized in many areas of the press, with much talk about mass surveillance. This is not mass surveillance. Three significant commissions in the UK have looked at this issue and have all unanimously concluded that it's not mass surveillance, it's about collecting bulk data which you can then use to combine with other bulk data to do some very precise targeting of individuals, or for the purposes of target discovery, identifying individuals out there who pose a threat that you didn't previously know about. Now, this is an area where I think there is still not unanimity within Europe as to how to play this. And I think we've seen some states, France a good case in point, veering in the direction of probably an excessive approach to this. Germany, whose political class have not been honest with their population about the value of security as a public good, finding themselves on the wrong side of the argument with the United States over the Snowden revelations, but aware the while that they are critically dependent upon US capabilities to keep them safe, and I think they're still working their way through that particular conundrum. The other area is, of course, the future of Schengen and the future of free travel, where we can debate that endlessly, but my view, for what it's worth, is that if the activities of Islamic State were to force an end to Schengen or to the principle of free travel within Europe, then that would constitute a significant and entirely unnecessary victory for Islamic State.
Thank you. Gentleman at the front, please.
Thank you. It's Masato Kimura, a Japanese journalist. I would like to have two questions. One is about Brussels attack, and the second is Afghan refugees. And I visited Molenbeek, and so about Abdeslam recruited by Islamic State, but radicalized by different sector. And I interviewed with a female mayor, and she said there are 22 mosques, and some mosques are very radicalized, and they are related to Moroccanian community. And also she thinks these mosques are affected by foreign actors like Saudi Arabia and something. And so she said it is supported in money and also affected by Salafis. And Nigel, do you have any information about such kind of radicalization network in global standard? And next is to Virginia, and I visited Lesbos and Greece, Idomeni, and I met many Afghan refugees. And but EU rejected Afghan as refugees. They will accept Syrian and Iraqi refugees only. But today's report said there are still huge conflict in Afghanistan. And what do you think about EU policy to Afghan refugees?
Okay, Jens, do you want to start off?
Yeah, on Afghanistan. I mean, far be it from me to comment on EU migration policy or not, but it is, yes, quite clear that a very large proportion of the refugees coming into Europe are from Afghanistan. If I recall correctly, at some point, perhaps as much as 25% were from Afghanistan. And that is because there has been a huge escalation in Afghanistan, especially in 2015, as a combination of the ISAF drawdown and a concomitant lack of improvement in capabilities in Afghan security forces, which then really emboldened the Taliban to go on a very countrywide offensive.
Okay, Nigel, do you want to just briefly on the first question?
Yeah. Well, on radicalization within mosques, I mean, this is a problem, but I think it is a generic problem in community terms, in that it tends to set elements of Islamic communities more apart from the society in which they find themselves, and makes it harder for them to integrate. But I don't think it's the primary cause of radicalization of young people who go to fight in Syria and Iraq. If you look at the young Belgians who were involved in the Paris attacks, most of them, until pretty much the moment they left for Syria and Iraq, lived profoundly secular lives with very little evidence of religion or religiosity. What was a common characteristic of these young men was that they were often involved in petty criminality and had kind of adopted, as a result, a kind of anti-establishment approach to life. And in that sense, going to fight for Islamic State in jihad was simply a next almost logical step in their anti-establishment trajectory. It had very little to do, if anything, to do with religion.
Okay, Virginia,
Yeah,
please.
just a small note. Of course, Afghanistan is more of Jens's remit. I just wanted to add to that although there's a serious trend, the flow of Afghan refugees, what we should consider over the next few months with the EU-Turkey agreement and NATO patrol, we are probably going to see a decrease in the flow of migrants using the eastern Mediterranean route. What we are likely to see at the same time is an increase of the flow from the using the central Mediterranean route, because that's what we tend to see during summertime. Of course, there are operations, especially Operation Sophia in the Mediterranean, that is already been ongoing for about 6 months, and has produced some results in terms of intercepting vessels, arresting traffickers, and also rescuing people. But I think that is something to be watched for the coming months.
And final thing on Afghanistan, if those you're interested in the spread of the conflict, pages 64 and 65 of the latest book maps it out quite clearly, and it was something that some of our colleagues in the BBC were very interested in asking some pointed questions about earlier today. Who would like to ask the next question? Yes, please.
My name is Juliet Coleman from Security Women. I would like the panel to comment on the role of the UN in preventing conflict in the world.
Okay. Who would like to take that first?
Okay, I can start saying something.
Thank you.
And then I'm sure my colleagues will help me. I think there is a growing understanding within UN circles, at least that's what I gathered from my own interactions, that the UN needs to change its approach. In a way, it's no longer fit for purpose for 21st century conflict. They're fully aware of that. And so there have been a number of reviews on peacekeeping particularly that are trying to address that. One of the issues, for instance, that they are considering is how to carry out peacekeeping in urban environments. And urban is something, and urban dynamics is something that I'm very keen on highlighting, not only because it's part of the book and is a theme of this year's Chart of Conflict, but it is a growing concern. Also from the point of view of the refugee crisis, we are seeing that the vast majority of refugees are now in urban environments. And this poses serious challenges because traditional humanitarian organizations, and if we want to take a broader approach, development organizations are much more focused on rural environments. So when the refugees or IDPs, if we're talking about internal displacements, reach these urban settings, they find a lack of humanitarian support.
Anything to add from the panel? No? The only thing I'd add on that is, and it's a point that Samir Puri knows very well, with the UN, we went through a period where some of the missions were slightly more muscular. I'm thinking particularly of DRC. But what's interesting, and something we referred to in the statement, it's actually African Union forces that have done more of the fighting in some of those African conflicts. So the UN has, in a way, shrunk back somewhat to a slightly more stabilizing role, and it's other actors that are taking the fight, some of the anti-government groups. Next question, please. While you're mulling, let me ask one of our panel, which is, the Armed Conflict Survey only looks at active conflicts that have some momentum behind them and some momentum behind them. So we don't, for instance, have South China Sea in there. We don't have bust-ups or dust-ups in any way. It's quite difficult to get into the armed conflict database and the Armed Conflict Survey, and sadly it's actually also quite difficult to leave But I think it's interesting to wonder what some of the conflicts might be that could come in. I know Virginia Kamali has one. Virginia, would you like to talk about that?
Yes, we do these rather depressing brainstorming sessions with colleagues from time to time, and I think looking at current trends and the trends over the course of 2015, I fear that a candidate for next year edition will be Burundi. Burundi is one of the countries, among many others in Africa, where president has decided to run for a third term. We have this third termism trend, or actually there are presidents who want to run for a fourth, fifth, or even more terms. So this happened last year amidst many protests and repressions of protesters. The president was indeed re-elected for a third term. But what we are seeing in the first few months of 2016 is that there is strong repression of the opposition. There are the disappearance. So there are quite high levels of violence, and people have also been displaced. And we have seen refugees from Burundi moving into Rwanda and also Tanzania. So I think this is something to watch, something to be concerned about.
Perhaps I can pick up a generic issue, and it really reflects something that one of the media at our media launch this morning asked me, which was essentially there doesn't seem to be say much about cyber in this volume. And my reply was, well, of course, it remains the case that nobody has demonstrably been killed as a consequence of any activity undertaken within the cyber domain. I think that is still effectively true, but of course we do know that cyber does play at very least an ancillary role in well, pretty much all the conflicts now that we are looking at. If you look at Syria, for example, you see that both the Assad regime and all the different opposition groups, including Jabhat Nusra and Islamic State, utilize social media and other cyber capabilities for battle space visibility and situational awareness, for information operations to promote their own narrative and discredit those of opponents, and also critically used extensively by civilians, basically just to find out what the hell is going on and to keep in touch with family and friends. So these these technical factors may at some point merit some separate consideration. The role of technology in conflicts.
Yes, please, gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. James Cunliffe, SCS Limited. Just a bit of feedback on the UN, actually. I've just finished working at DPKO in New York, and I was also in DRC mission. What would be quite interesting in Burundi, of course, most of the violence is in Bujumbura, and so it is, in a sense, quite a limited area. And one thing that would be very interesting to see what happens for the UN is their policy of inter-mission cooperation. The idea that a neighbouring country, such as Burundi, is capable of drawing peacekeeping troops from out of DRC quickly into Burundi. It is really right next door. And it'd be interesting to see if they are able to do that. It's always a big logistical challenge, not least needing Burundi to approve that idea. I think the other challenge with the UN peacekeeping operations is that we became increasingly focused on protection of civilians at the expense of almost anything else. So any ability to go against rebel forces or really be robust in peacekeeping was always slightly secondary to the sort of the challenge of protecting protecting civilian populations. Sorry, that's a bit of a preamble, but could we talk about North and South Korea? Is that possible? I know it's not full, but it'd be interesting to know what your views are on future conflict. Thank you.
Well, North-South Korea obviously is a conflict that, it isn't a conflict. We don't actually have any fatalities there. Evidently, it's one of the few conflicts in the world that could very quickly come into the pages of the Armed Conflict Survey and the Armed Conflict Database. If either of our Jens or Nigel would like to offer an opinion, that's fine, but keep it short. We want to focus on what's in the book and the conflicts.
There's not a lot to say at the moment because obviously, you know, there is this effective standoff at the moment, it seems unclear whether anything can rein in the behaviour of the fat little man in the boiler suit. You know, even the Chinese have more or less given up trying. You know, but they take the position that the status quo is better than any attempt to change it, which, from their point of view, could prove destabilising. So it's a question of kind of managing the situation. We've got a major party congress taking place in Pyongyang imminently. Be very interesting to see what the fallout from that actually amounts to. The key question obviously remains how stable is the regime, and were the Kims at some point to be replaced, would what came next be easier or harder to deal with?
Thank you, Nigel. Before we move to the next question, just a point of information, our colleague Heber is based in ISS Middle East in Bahrain, covers several of the conflicts in the database, including Iraq, Yemen and Egypt. And living in the region and travelling around the region, you might be missing a trick if you don't try and tap her knowledge before she leaves, because she'll not be here for very long. Yeah. Next question, you please, sir. Just again, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
That segues nicely to Mr. Ha. We have talked about Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. We tend to also discussion of violence in the Middle East. We no longer seem to hear very much about Israel-Palestine. Has peace broken out? Have they resolved? I mean, what's happened there? Or is it still simmering under the brushes, as it were, ready to burst? I would really appreciate an update. Thank you.
Actually, no, there has not been peace in Israel-Palestine, surprisingly. There's been a wave of attacks since, I think, mid-2014 onwards, and it's only been escalating since 2015 was probably, I mean, after the Gaza war, if we exclude the Gaza war in the West Bank, 2015 there was serious escalations going on in Israel-Palestine. A lot of the attacks that are taking place are being conducted by young Palestinians in the West Bank who are most of the time stabbing people. A lot of people at checkpoints, and a lot of the times the response is kind of disproportionate, so they get shot immediately, and it's really causing quite a bit of disruption in the West Bank. And I think it comes also at a time when there's very little prospects for peace, and the peace process has been practically dead since the last Kerry-sponsored negotiations. And I think a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank are extremely frustrated, and there's very little kind of hope. The economy isn't doing very well. So, no, I think the situation is still really bad. It's just kind of overshadowed by, you know, the conflicts that are taking place that are a lot more intense as Syria, Iraq.
One of the questions we get is around fatality counts and how they change year on year, and how we compile them, and what counts as a conflict death and what doesn't count as a conflict death. There is an explanatory note at the back of the book about that, but I'd like to ask our editor, Anastasia Voronkova, just to say something about how it is we go about this very difficult process of putting a number on things.
We count fatalities that are the direct result of conflict. We do a body count, so we have a conservative methodology. We do a body count. We compare it to other available estimates in public and published sources, and come up with an estimate. We fully accept that some of our fatalities figures may well be an underestimate, but we prefer to stick to our traditional methodology.
Okay. Anything else? Yes, please, sir.
William Birtles, I'm a member. What significance, if any, should one read into the press reports in the last week about apparent collaboration between the Assad regime and ISIS in terms of targeting?
Collaboration between the Assad regime and ISIS. I can't say for sure, to be honest, but I think a lot of Syrians have been talking about this for a very long time, and from the very beginning, a lot of Syrians have been saying, if not active collaboration, but some kind of tacit understanding that Assad has not been, or Assad's forces and allied militias, Iranian forces, have not been fighting against ISIS, because it's kind of in their strategic interest that ISIS is propped up at the expense of the other groups, because that kind of undermines the rebellion by the rest of the groups. So I don't know, but I do think that there has been for a very long time speculation that there's been some kind of tacit agreement between Assad and ISIS, and I think that it is very much in Assad's interests to kind of let, and I think that all that being said does not kind of undermine the fact that they did go in Palmyra, and they did, and that was kind of a very symbolic victory. But yeah, I think this is something a lot of Syrians have been talking about from the very beginning.
Samir, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask for an update and a prognosis on the war against Al-Shabaab. So Kenya, Somalia, if somebody could maybe summarize what the trends are, dominant trends from the year gone by, and where it's looking like it's heading in the future.
I think there has been some progress, in particular thanks to the African Union missions, but I think Al-Shabaab has also proven over the years its resilience. It has survived decapitation of leaders, it has survived killings, it has survived territorial losses, and I think it's still likely to attract those members of the wider population that are preoccupied with local issues, economic economic situation, dire humanitarian situation, that are focused not on global global jihad, global issues like ISIS, for example, but that are more preoccupied with and dissatisfied with the Somali government, and are focused on the fight against the Somali government. I think other groups, Somalia has been a particularly difficult operating ground for other groups. We have to take into account that, as the book details, it had taken 3 years for Al-Shabaab for members of Al-Shabaab to ally themselves with Al-Qaeda. Now there is evidence of growing struggle within Al-Shabaab between those who want to remain loyal to Al-Shabaab and those who want to switch their allegiances to ISIS. And I think this struggle will continue. The book also details that there is some evidence of resistance to Al-Shabaab among the wider population, among those who are dissatisfied, for example, with its attempts to impose Sharia law, to collect Islamic taxes. But I think overall it still remains relatively resilient, although ISIS also has the potential to expand its influence.
Okay.
especially perhaps among younger groups.
Thank you. Virginia.
Yeah, just as a footnote, I think exactly as Anastasia has mentioned, as a fight, as a generational fight, I would say, within Al-Shabaab between the older generations, people who have struggled for a long time before Al-Shabaab actually became officially part of the Al-Qaeda franchise, and people that are determined to remain part of the Al-Qaeda franchise. And then there are the younger fighters who have seen over the past several months many of the territories recaptured by the Amazon troops, many fighters being killed and decapitation of the leaders. And on the other hand, they are seeing the success achieved by ISIS, so they want to switch allegiance. So there have been several cases of defections, even of some senior figures and religious leaders of the group. As a result, Al-Shabaab has launched a number of repressive measures to kill the dissidents. I think the other perhaps interesting development is more about this year, is very recent, earlier this week, the first batch of UK soldiers have arrived in Somalia. There's just 10 of them at the moment. There will be up to 70. They will be involved in medical engineering and logistical support, and this is part of David Cameron's pledge back in September last year to double contribution to peacekeeping missions around the world. And so others will also be sent to South Sudan. At least the first team has arrived in Somalia, so we'll see how that will develop.
Okay. Last question, sir. If it's a quick one.
I'm Carlos Tesh from Brazilian Army. I'm very happy because during the discussion, Brazil didn't appear in the talks. But do the next Olympic Games in Rio, I'd like to know something about the possibility of terror attacks in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you.
Right. Fortunately, on the front row, we have Antonio Sampaio.
Yep. Thank you, Colonel. We were talking about this with Brazilian journalists this morning. There are two low probability, I think, threats to the Rio Olympics. One is terrorism, that if Nigel wants to comment, it's not really my area of expertise. But on the organized crime front, I think that the state authorities in Rio have made significant progress in taking territory from the gangs. So organized crime in Rio has traditionally been very territorially based, and their source of power and revenue has always been their slum areas. And because they've lost most of these areas, their power and their capabilities has been diminished. But at the same time, and different from previous mega sporting events, with the exception of the World Cup, but the criminal underworld in Rio is more unstable because of that. So my view is that there is a slightly higher probability than before the pacification program in the favelas, the kind of peacekeeping efforts to dominate Islam. Before this program began, the criminal underworld was more stable during the decades that the Red Command and other gangs dominated the scene there. And now I think there is more conflict, and the criminal groups are still negotiating which territory belongs to which group, and how to enter Islam, and how to regain territory, how to test the patience and the capabilities of the state forces. So there is the highest possibility, whereas still low, is of conflicts within the gangs, conflicts between the different gangs, not directly targeted attacks because of the Olympic Games to target foreigners or anything.
Thank you. I'm afraid I have to bring it to a close there. If you'd like a copy of the book, half price for all members downstairs at reception. But please join me in thanking our panel. They've worked so hard to actually produce the book. Nigel is the honourable exception, and also many colleagues around the room. So please join me in thanking them.